Before we dive into today's terrifying tale, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. Don't forget to click the bell icon so you never miss a spine-chilling story. Let's get into it.
The rental room.
I had just moved to a small town in the United States to attend university, eager to start this new chapter of my life. Money was tight, so when I found a cheap room for rent in an old house, it felt like a stroke of luck. The house was a bit run down, with peeling paint and a sagging porch, but it had character. The landlord, an elderly man named Mr. Jacobs, seemed kind, though there was something off about him. He had a habit of staring just a little too long, his watery blue eyes following me as I moved my things into the room. The room itself was small but functional. The walls were painted a faded yellow, and the furniture was old, mismatched, and worn. The bed creaked whenever I shifted, and the floorboards groaned underfoot. Despite its imperfections, I convinced myself that it was just what I needed, a quiet place to focus on my studies. At first, I chalked up the house's quirks to its age. The creaky floors, the way the windows rattled in their frames on windy nights, and the persistent musty smell. It was all part of living in an old building. Mr. Jacobs' odd behavior didn't bother me much either. I figured he was just a lonely old man with few tenants to keep him company. But then I started noticing small, unsettling things. A book I'd left on the nightstand would be on the floor when I returned. The closet door, which I was sure I had closed, would be slightly ajar. My shoes, neatly lined up by the door, would be askew in the morning. These were little things, easy to dismiss or blame on my own forgetfulness, but they began to add up. The feeling of being watched was the worst of it. Sometimes, I'd be sitting at my desk, studying, and I'd get the distinct sensation that someone was standing right behind me. My skin would prickle, and I'd whip around, only to find the room empty. At night, I'd lie in bed, staring into the darkness, certain that I wasn't alone. I told myself it was just nerves, the stress of adjusting to a new place, but the unease grew stronger with each passing day. There was something wrong with the room, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up, but I was determined not to let it get to me. After all, it was just an old house with a quirky landlord. Nothing more, nothing less. At least that's what I kept telling myself. As the days turned into weeks, Mr. Jacobs' behavior became increasingly unsettling. At first, it was just little things. He'd knock on my door late at night with flimsy excuses, asking if I needed anything or if everything was all right. His presence lingered longer than necessary, his eyes scanning the room as if he was looking for something. I'd often find him standing in the hallway when I opened the door, his thin frame barely visible in the dim light. His footsteps were soft, almost deliberate, but I could hear them just outside my door, pacing back and forth in the dead of night. It wasn't just the landlord that unsettled me. The house itself seemed to be alive with sounds that defied explanation. Late at night, when the world outside was silent, I'd hear noises that made my skin crawl. Footsteps creaked on the wooden floorboards above me, moving slowly as if someone was deliberately trying to avoid detection. Whispers, barely audible, drifted through the walls, too faint to make out the words but persistent enough to send chills down my spine. Then there were the more alarming sounds, the unmistakable noise of furniture being dragged across the floor in the middle of the night. The first time I heard it, I sat up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. It was a grating, scraping sound, like heavy objects being pushed across the floor directly above my room. But when I checked the next day, nothing seemed out of place. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it was just the old house settling, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. Mr. Jacobs' behavior only added to my growing unease. I started to notice how he seemed to watch me from the shadows, his gaze intense and unblinking. Whenever I caught him staring, he would quickly avert his eyes, pretending to be busy with something else. But the look in his eyes, there was something there, something that made my stomach twist with anxiety. I couldn't shake the feeling that he knew more than he was letting on, that he was somehow connected to the strange occurrences in the house. The way he moved, so quietly, so deliberately, as if he was trying not to be heard. It all pointed to something sinister. My suspicions grew with each passing day, and I found myself dreading the nights, knowing that the sounds and the unsettling presence of my landlord would only intensify in the darkness. I wanted to confront him, to ask what was really going on in this house, but fear kept me silent. I didn't know what I was dealing with, and the uncertainty was eating away at me. The sense of dread was becoming unbearable, and I knew I couldn't stay in this place much longer. But before I could leave, I needed to understand what was happening. There had to be an explanation for the strange noises, the feeling of being watched, and Mr. Jacobs' bizarre behavior. I just had to figure out what it was, before it was too late. Driven by a mixture of curiosity and mounting fear, I knew I had to investigate the unsettling occurrences in my room. One evening, when Mr. Jacobs was out on one of his mysterious errands, I seized the opportunity. My heart raced as I carefully tiptoed through the house, making sure not to make a sound. I needed answers, and I hoped that searching the room might provide some clue to the strange events. The room was as I left it, a jumble of scattered belongings and dim shadows. I focused on the floorboards, which had always seemed slightly uneven. I had a hunch that something might be hidden beneath them. With trembling hands, I pried up a loose floorboard near the corner of the room. It came up with a groan, revealing a small, dusty cavity below. I reached into the darkness and pulled out a collection of items wrapped in old, crumbling fabric. My pulse quickened as I unwrapped the bundle to reveal a series of faded photographs and a stack of yellowed letters. The photos were the first thing I examined. They depicted young men, each with a look of sheer terror in their eyes. They were dressed in casual clothing, and in each picture, they appeared to be in various stages of distress. It was as if their fear was frozen in time, captured forever on film. I turned my attention to the letters, which were hastily scrawled in a shaky hand. The writing was difficult to decipher, but the desperation was palpable. Phrases like, "Please help me," and "They're watching" jumped out from the pages. My hands shook as I flipped through them, realizing that these were not just random notes. They were pleas from previous tenants. Each letter seemed to detail a growing sense of dread and a looming threat. The final letter was the most disturbing. It was only half written, the ink smudged as if the writer had been interrupted abruptly. The last coherent words were, "They're coming for me. The rest of the letter trailed off into a series of frantic scribbles. It was clear that whatever had happened to these tenants had been sudden and violent. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead as the implications sank in. These were not just random incidents. There was a pattern here. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. These men had all lived in this very room, and they had vanished without a trace. The thought that they might have experienced the same fear and helplessness that I was feeling now was almost too much to bear. I carefully replaced the items and put the floorboard back in place, my mind racing with thoughts of what I had just uncovered. The photographs and letters had painted a grim picture, one that suggested that Mr. Jacobs was not just an eccentric old man, but perhaps something far more sinister. The knowledge that the previous tenants had disappeared under mysterious and horrifying circumstances left me paralyzed with fear. As I lay in bed that night, my mind replayed the images of those terrified faces and the chilling words from the letters. I knew I couldn't stay here much longer. I had to find out the truth about Mr. Jacobs and this house before I became another name in a stack of forgotten letters. But the weight of what I had discovered was almost too much to bear. That night, sleep eluded me entirely. My mind was a whirlwind of images and thoughts, the faces of the previous tenants haunting me with their terrified expressions. I lay in bed. Every creak of the house and every whisper of the wind outside seemed to amplify my growing dread. Around midnight, the silence of the house was pierced by the unmistakable sound of footsteps outside my door. My heart jumped into my throat. I knew those footsteps all too well, the same soft, deliberate steps that had become the soundtrack of my sleepless nights. I held my breath and listened as they grew closer, only to stop directly outside my room. I sat up in bed, my eyes wide in the dark, watching the shadow under the door. The soft creak of the hinges was like a death knell as the door slowly opened. Through the narrow gap, I saw the dim outline of Mr. Jacobs's figure. He was holding something in his hand, but the darkness obscured its details. My mind raced with possibilities, each one more horrifying than the last. Panic surged through me, and I knew I had to leave immediately. I tried to push the covers aside, but my limbs felt like lead. As I fumbled to get out of bed, Mr. Jacobs's voice cut through the darkness, calm and eerily soothing. "I see you found my little hiding place," he said, his tone unnervingly pleasant. My breath caught in my throat. The realization hit me like a cold wave. He knew I had discovered the hidden photographs and letters. The fear that had been building up in my chest now threatened to overwhelm me entirely. He stepped further into the room, and the dim light from the hallway revealed his face. The sight was enough to freeze me in place. His eyes were wide and unblinking, a frenzied, almost deranged look in them. There was something dark and twisted in his expression, a look that spoke of a deep-seated malevolence. He moved closer, the object in his hand becoming clearer. It was a large, rusted key, the kind used for heavy, old-fashioned locks. The sight of it made my skin crawl. My mind raced with thoughts of what that key might unlock. Perhaps a hidden cellar or a room where the horrors of the past were kept. "Do you know what happens to those who uncover the truth?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "They become part of the story." His words were like ice in my veins. I could barely think, only react. I scrambled out of bed and headed for the door, but he was quicker. He blocked the exit, his movement unnaturally swift for his age. His presence seemed to fill the room, making the space feel constricting and claustrophobic. In a frantic effort to escape, I looked around the room for any possible exit. The window was my only hope. I darted towards it, throwing it open with a force born of sheer terror. The night air was cold and fresh, a stark contrast to the stifling atmosphere inside the room. Mr. Jacobs's voice echoed behind me, filled with a twisted mix of amusement and menace. "You can't run forever. This house has a way of keeping its secrets." As I climbed out of the window and dropped to the ground below, I heard his footsteps retreating back into the house. I ran into the darkness, my heart pounding with adrenaline and fear. The cold night air felt invigorating against my flushed face, but the terror of what I had just faced lingered like a shadow. I knew that escaping from the house was only the first step. The fear of what Mr. Jacobs was capable of and the realization that he had been watching me all along made every shadow and every sound feel like a threat. The encounter left me shaken, but more determined than ever to uncover the full extent of the horror hidden within those walls. In a frantic burst of adrenaline, I lunged past Mr. Jacobs and bolted out of the room. My heart felt like it was about to explode from sheer terror as I sprinted through the dimly lit hallway. The house seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, each creak of the floorboards and whisper of the wind amplifying the sense of dread that gripped me. It was as if the very walls were alive with the anguish of the tenants who had come before me. I raced down the stairs, my feet barely touching the steps as I flew past them. The echoes of terrified cries and desperate pleas seemed to follow me, a haunting symphony of past suffering that made my skin crawl. The old house's shadows seemed to reach out, trying to drag me back into its clutches. When I finally reached the front door, I flung it open with a force that made the hinges groan in protest. I dashed out into the cold night air, the relief of being outside briefly overpowering the terror that still clung to me. I ran down the street, not daring to look back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The darkness of the night seemed both a refuge and a threat, concealing the dangers that might still be lurking. Eventually, I found help at a nearby gas station. The clerk looked at me with a mixture of confusion and concern as I relayed my desperate story. They called the police, but by the time they arrived at the house, Mr. Jacobs was gone, and there was no sign of the horrors I had described. The house was quiet, its secrets seemingly locked away once more. I left the town as quickly as I could, driving far away from the place where the nightmare had unfolded. But even as I distanced myself from that cursed house, the fear didn't dissipate. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, convinced that Mr. Jacobs, or the curse of that room, might find me wherever I went. The memory of that night haunted my dreams and tainted my waking hours. Every new place I moved to felt tainted by the shadow of that old house. I would sometimes catch myself checking the corners of my rooms or listening intently to the sounds of the night, convinced that the specter of that landlord was following me. Despite all efforts to escape, the terror of the room stayed with me, a lingering reminder that some horrors are not easily left behind. The thought that the room's curse might continue to haunt me wherever I went left an unsettling feeling that never quite faded. The fear that I might never truly be free of the darkness that began in that room is a haunting thought that remains with me to this day.
The stranger in the mirror.
I had just moved into a charming old house in a quiet neighborhood, eager for a fresh start after a particularly rough year. The house had a character that I found comforting: creaky wooden floors, intricate moldings, and a quaint garden that seemed to promise peace and solitude. I was excited to settle in, unpack, and embrace this new chapter of my life. Everything seemed perfect at first. The days were filled with the routine of organizing and decorating, and I began to feel at home. But then, as I started to get used to the space, I began to notice something unsettling. It started subtly. I would catch a glimpse of a shadowy figure in the corner of a mirror. Nothing clear, just a dark shape that seemed to flit away as soon as I tried to focus on it. I told myself it was just my imagination or perhaps the lighting playing tricks. After all, old houses had a way of distorting reality, right? But the figure kept appearing, always in the mirrors. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease, attributing it to the stress of moving and adjusting to a new place. Every time I looked in a mirror, whether it was in the bathroom, bedroom, or hallway, that fleeting shape seemed to be there, just beyond clear sight. At first, I avoided looking at the mirrors directly, but that didn't help. I could still sense its presence, like an ever-present shadow lurking at the edge of my vision. No matter how much I tried to ignore it, the sense of being watched grew stronger with each passing day. I would catch myself glancing nervously at the mirrors, only to find nothing but my own reflection staring back at me. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing more than my tired mind playing tricks. Maybe it was just the adjustment period, or perhaps a side effect of moving into a house with so much history. But no matter how much I rationalized it, the unsettling feeling never quite went away. The figure seemed to be always there, just out of sight, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. As the days went by, the figure in the mirrors started to change. It was no longer just a fleeting shadow. It had taken on a more defined shape, a vague, shadowy silhouette that seemed to have a presence of its own. The more I tried to ignore it, the more it seemed to assert itself, growing increasingly difficult to dismiss. I became obsessed with avoiding mirrors. I started covering them with cloths, hiding them behind furniture, and even taping up newspapers to block any reflective surfaces. But no matter how hard I tried, the figure still managed to appear in other reflections: windows, glass surfaces, and even the shiny metal of appliances. It was as if no matter where I looked, there was always some surface where the figure would make itself known. My nights were plagued by restless sleep. I would toss and turn, drenched in sweat, haunted by dreams where the figure was moving closer, its shadowy form watching me with an eerie intensity. I'd wake up with my heart racing, convinced that the figure had been inches away from me while I slept. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, an oppressive weight pressing down on me. I started questioning my sanity, wondering if I was slipping into paranoia or if something genuinely sinister was happening. I could no longer differentiate between dreams and reality. The figure seemed to follow me, an omnipresent specter that refused to leave me in peace. Every creak in the house, every gust of wind, and every change in light seemed to bring the figure closer. I felt like a prisoner in my own home, trapped in a space where my attempts to escape the figure only seemed to draw it nearer. The sense of dread was consuming me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that no matter how hard I tried, the figure was always lurking, waiting for the right moment to reveal its true nature. One night, I was jolted awake by an icy chill in the room. My heart pounded as I turned to the bedroom mirror, and what I saw left me paralyzed with fear. The figure wasn't just a shadow anymore. It had taken on a solid, unmistakable form. Its features were still obscured, but its presence was undeniably malevolent. It stood right in front of me, staring with an intensity that seemed to pierce through my very soul. I tried to move, to scream, but my body felt like it was encased in concrete. Every muscle was locked, and no sound escaped my lips. The figure's eyes, if they could even be called that, seemed to bore into me, conveying a sense of dark intent that made my skin crawl. It wasn't just watching. It was as if it was trying to reach out to me, to communicate something that I couldn't quite grasp. The terror was overwhelming. The figure's presence grew more aggressive, pushing against the boundaries of the mirror as if it was straining to break through. I felt a growing pressure, as if the figure's malevolence was seeping into the room, suffocating me with its oppressive energy. Desperate for answers, I knew I had to confront whatever was happening. I began researching the house's history, hoping to find some explanation for the figure's persistence. What I uncovered was chilling. The house had a dark past involving the previous owner, a man who had vanished without a trace under mysterious circumstances. The more I dug, the clearer the connections became. The figure, it seemed, was tied to the house's history, linked to the disappearance of the previous occupant. The revelations sent a shiver down my spine. The figure's connection to the house and its dark past made it all too clear that it wasn't just a figment of my imagination. It was a part of something far more sinister, something that had been lying in wait, hidden in the shadows of this old house. The growing terror was now accompanied by a deep sense of dread, as I realized that whatever was haunting me had a purpose, and its presence was far more dangerous than I had ever imagined. The realization that the figure was more than just a trick of the light or a figment of my imagination was terrifying. I knew I had to confront it, to face whatever malevolent force had been tormenting me. I gathered every ounce of courage I had and approached the mirror where the figure appeared most frequently, the one in the hallway that seemed to be its favorite spot. As I stood before it, the air around me grew colder, and a heavy silence settled in the room. The figure materialized more clearly in the glass, its form becoming increasingly distinct. Its face emerged from the murky depths of the mirror, and I could see its eyes, dark, hollow, and filled with a chilling, malevolent intent. The expression was one of cold, unfeeling malice, a stark contrast to the fleeting shadows I had seen before. A cold breeze swept through the room, causing a shiver to race down my spine. Faint whispers filled the air, barely audible but unmistakably sinister. It was as if the figure was trying to communicate with me, its voice layered with an eerie, disembodied quality. The whispers merged into an unintelligible murmur, but the tone was unmistakably threatening. The atmosphere in the room grew thick with an oppressive force, a heavy weight that pressed down on me and made it hard to breathe. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the mirror, feeling an overwhelming sense of impending doom. The figure's presence was suffocating, its dark energy enveloping me in a paralyzing fear. As I watched, the mirror began to fog up, the condensation swirling into shapes that seemed to dance around the figure. Through the mist, I could barely make out a message forming on the glass, words that sent a wave of terror crashing over me. The figure knew me, knew things about me that I hadn't shared with anyone, and it was coming for me. The chilling realization hit me hard. The figure wasn't just a shadow or a ghost of the past. It was a very real threat, a dark presence that had been waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. My pulse raced as I backed away from the mirror, the sense of dread more intense than ever. The figure's message was clear. It was not finished with me, and whatever it had planned was far from over. My fear reached a paralyzing peak as I began to realize that the figure was no longer confined to the mirrors. It was manifesting itself in physical forms around my home. Objects moved on their own, furniture shifting, doors creaking open and slamming shut. Strange, eerie noises filled the house, like whispers carried by a cold wind that seemed to come from nowhere. I knew I had to leave before things escalated further. I packed in a frantic frenzy, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread. But no matter where I looked, there it was, the figure haunting every reflective surface. Its presence was becoming more pronounced, its intentions growing increasingly clear and horrifying. The figure seemed to close in on me with every passing second, a chilling reminder of its intent to follow me. In my desperate attempt to escape, I fled the house as quickly as I could. The night air felt sharp against my skin as I hurriedly drove away, my heart racing with a mix of terror and relief. But even as I left, the figure's presence seemed to follow me. I could feel its eyes on me, a lingering, unsettling sensation that refused to fade. No matter how far I traveled or where I went, the feeling of being watched persisted. The figure's gaze seemed to be a constant shadow in my life, a haunting presence that followed me even in the safety of my new surroundings. The final revelation hit me with a gut-wrenching clarity. The figure was not just a mere apparition or a figment of my imagination. It was part of something far more sinister and enduring. It wasn't bound by the mirrors or the house. It was connected to a deeper, darker force that I had unwittingly become entangled with. The terror was no longer just a passing fear, but a permanent reminder that some horrors are inescapable, and the malevolent presence would forever linger in the corners of my mind. The abandoned house.
The sun hung low in the sky as we gathered at the edge of the forest, our group of scouts buzzing with excitement and just a hint of trepidation. I remember looking around at the others, Mike, always the fearless leader, Sarah, whose curiosity often got the better of her, James, the skeptic who never believed in ghost stories, and Emily, quiet but perceptive, her eyes always scanning the horizon for something others might miss. Then there was me, eager for adventure but not entirely sure what we were getting ourselves into. We were deep in the Pacific Northwest, miles away from civilization. This was supposed to be just another one of our weekend hikes, a chance to test our skills and bond as a group. But there was something different about this trip. We all felt it, though no one wanted to admit it. The cabin we were heading towards had a reputation, one that was whispered about in hushed tones around campfires and at late-night gatherings. People said it was cursed, that those who ventured too close never came back the same. Naturally, we couldn't resist. The hike started off like any other. We joked and laughed, the sound of our voices mingling with the crunch of leaves and the distant calls of birds. But as we ventured deeper into the woods, something changed. The forest grew quieter, the air heavier. The usual sounds of wildlife, birds chirping, squirrels rustling in the underbrush, faded away, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to press in on us from all sides. "Is it just me, or is it too quiet?" Sarah asked, her voice cutting through the stillness. I nodded, glancing around. The trees loomed tall and thick, their branches creating a dense canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. I noticed something else, too, strange markings carved into the trunks of the trees. At first, I thought they were just random scratches, but the more I looked, the more they seemed deliberate, almost like symbols. "Probably just some kids messing around," James said when I pointed them out. But his tone lacked its usual confidence, and I could tell he was just trying to reassure himself as much as us. As we continued, the forest seemed to grow darker, the path less distinct. The air felt thick, like we were walking through a heavy mist, even though the sky above was clear. It was unsettling, but none of us wanted to be the first to back out. Finally, after what felt like hours, we saw it, the cabin. It stood in a small clearing, its wooden walls weathered and gray, the roof sagging in places. The windows were dark, and the front door hung slightly ajar, creaking softly as the wind blew. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years, maybe decades. But there was something else, too, an overwhelming sense of unease that settled over us as we approached. The cabin seemed to watch us, its empty windows like eyes tracking our every move. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I pushed it aside. We had come this far, there was no turning back now. "Looks like it's seen better days," Mike said, trying to lighten the mood. But his voice was strained, and I could tell he felt it too, the sense that we were intruding on something that didn't want to be disturbed. We hesitated for a moment at the threshold, peering into the dim interior. The air was stale, carrying the scent of old wood and something else I couldn't quite place. Finally, Mike took the first step inside, and we followed, our footsteps echoing on the creaking floorboards. Inside, the cabin was as old and worn as it looked from the outside. The furniture was sparse, a couple of chairs, a table, all covered in a thick layer of dust. The walls were bare, except for more of those strange markings, carved into the wood just like the trees outside. A chill hung in the air, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. "We should check it out, see if there's anything interesting," Sarah suggested, though I could hear the uncertainty in her voice. I agreed, though a part of me wished we would just turn around and leave. But curiosity got the better of us, and we began to explore the cabin, unaware of the nightmarish events that would soon unfold. As we ventured further into the cabin, the initial thrill of exploration began to wear off, replaced by an unsettling sense of foreboding. The dust-covered furniture and cobwebs were just the beginning. There was something more, something that made my skin crawl and my heart race with anxiety. We split up to explore the various rooms, each of us trying to avoid stepping into the shadows of our own fears. In one corner, I found a collection of old photographs, their edges curled and yellowed with age. The faces in the pictures were faded, their expressions frozen in time. There was a cracked mirror leaning against the wall, reflecting our uneasy faces as we moved past it. The sight of it made me shiver, as though the mirror was showing more than just our reflections. In the center of the main room, we stumbled upon something truly disturbing, a large, crude circle etched into the wooden floor. It was surrounded by strange symbols and runes, carved deep into the wood. The markings seemed almost deliberate, as though they were meant to serve some dark purpose. The circle was in disrepair, with parts of it obscured by dust and debris, but it was unmistakably a ritualistic symbol. My curiosity mingled with dread as I tried to make sense of it. "Is that what I think it is?" Emily asked, her voice trembling slightly. "It's definitely some kind of ritual circle," Mike replied, his voice low and wary. "But why is it here?" Before we could answer that question, our attention was drawn to a door at the end of a narrow hallway. It was old and weathered, but what made it peculiar was that it was locked from the inside. There was no keyhole on this side, just a heavy, iron lock that looked as though it hadn't been touched in years. The door seemed almost to beckon us with its mysterious aura, but none of us were eager to find out what lay behind it. "Maybe it's just storage or something," James suggested, though he didn't sound very convinced. The evening was wearing on, and as the sun dipped below the horizon, the cabin grew darker and colder. We lit a few lanterns and settled in for what we hoped would be a quiet night. But as darkness enveloped us, the sounds started. At first, it was just creaking, the old house settling, or so we told ourselves. But then came the footsteps, soft, deliberate steps moving across the floor above us, though there was no one else in the cabin. We tried to ignore it, but the sounds continued, a rhythmic pattern that seemed to echo our growing unease. Then there was scratching, sharp, insistent noises coming from the walls, as if something, or someone, was trying to get in. I glanced at the others, their faces pale and strained, and the whispers began. Faint at first, they grew louder and more distinct, though I could never quite make out the words. It was as if they were coming from all around us, mingling with the cold drafts that blew through the cracks in the walls. "This place is giving me the creeps," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I feel like we're not alone." We decided to gather in the main room, hoping that being together might ward off the growing sense of dread. We tried to make light of the situation, laughing nervously and talking about our plans for the next day. But the cabin had other plans. The shadows seemed to lengthen and stretch as if they were alive, and every creak, every whisper seemed to amplify the oppressive atmosphere. Then, it happened. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a shadowy figure darting down the hallway, moving too quickly for me to get a clear look. I blinked and turned to the others, but they had seen nothing. We searched the hallway, our lanterns casting eerie, flickering light on the walls, but the figure was gone. "I swear I saw something," I insisted, but the others looked at me with a mix of doubt and concern. The atmosphere in the cabin was growing heavier, more suffocating, and I could see the fear taking hold of my friends. The first night in the cabin was proving to be more terrifying than we had anticipated. The noises grew louder, more insistent, and the feeling that we were being watched grew stronger. We tried to ignore it, to convince ourselves that it was just our imagination, but deep down, we all knew that something was terribly wrong. As we huddled together, the whispers seemed to grow louder, more urgent. The night stretched on, and with each passing hour, the cabin's oppressive grip tightened around us. Morning light filtered through the cracks in the walls, casting long, eerie shadows across the cabin's interior. I hoped that a fresh start would clear the fog of fear and uncertainty that had settled over us. But as soon as we tried to open the front door, our hopes were dashed. The handle turned, but the door remained firmly shut. We pushed and pulled, but it wouldn't budge. "What the hell?" Mike muttered, his voice tinged with frustration. "It was working just fine yesterday. We tried every window, but they were sealed shut with wooden planks and nails. It was as if the cabin had decided to keep us inside, no matter how hard we tried to leave." The reality of our situation hit us all at once. We were trapped, and there was no immediate way out. Panic began to set in. The group's initial attempts to stay calm and rational quickly disintegrated. Everyone started blaming each other for our predicament. James accused Mike of leading us into this mess, while Sarah snapped at Emily for not warning us about the warnings she'd read. Emily, usually quiet, began to withdraw into herself, her eyes darting around nervously. "You knew about this place?" James shouted at Mike. "You knew it was a bad idea." Mike's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. I didn't know it would be like this. I thought it was just some old cabin. The tension grew so thick it felt almost tangible, pressing down on us like the heavy air outside. We tried to maintain some semblance of order, but it was clear that the fear and mistrust were starting to take their toll. We had no idea what was happening, but the cabin seemed to amplify our anxieties and make every sound and movement feel like a threat. Then the disturbances started. At first, it was small things, a chair sliding across the floor with no one touching it, books tumbling off shelves as if pushed by an unseen hand. We would all rush to investigate, but there was never an explanation, only more unease. Is someone messing with us? Sarah asked, her voice shaking. Or is this place really haunted? We all looked at each other, the fear evident in our eyes. There were no logical explanations for what was happening. The cabin's oppressive atmosphere was becoming almost unbearable. I began hearing it then, a voice, low and insistent, calling my name. At first, it was just a faint whisper, so soft I thought I might have imagined it. But as the day wore on, it grew louder, more persistent. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but it was no use. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. I'd hear it clearly when I was alone, but when I called out to the others, they heard nothing. It was as if the cabin itself was trying to isolate me, to make me question my own sanity. Are you okay? Emily asked me, her concern evident as she noticed my increasingly distracted and troubled demeanor. I'm fine, I lied, forcing a smile. Just hearing things. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. The whispers seemed to know my name, and they grew louder and more demanding with each passing hour. I could barely concentrate on anything else as the voice became a constant presence in my mind, weaving in and out of my thoughts like a sinister melody. As the day wore on, the cabin's grip on us tightened. The atmosphere was thick with fear and suspicion, and the moving objects seemed to mock our attempts to stay rational. The whispers continued, growing louder and more insistent, as if urging me to listen, to follow. I could feel the cabin closing in on us, trapping us in its web of malevolent energy. The whispers were relentless, and with each passing moment, the sense of dread grew stronger. I knew we had to find a way out, but with every attempt to escape thwarted, and with the cabin seemingly alive and aware of our every move, I couldn't shake the feeling that our chances of leaving were slipping away. The cabin had become a maze of shadows and fear. As the hours dragged on, we saw glimpses of something in the corners of our eyes, shadowy figures flitting just beyond our sight. Each time we tried to confront them, the figures vanished, leaving only the chill of their presence and our growing dread. Did you see that? Sarah would ask, her eyes wide with fear as she pointed towards the darkness. Yeah, I saw something, Mike would reply, his voice trembling. But it's gone now. We tried to keep our composure, but the relentless haunting began to take its toll on our sanity. The cabin seemed to press in on us, amplifying our fears and weaknesses. James, once so skeptical, began to talk to himself, mumbling incoherently as he paced back and forth. It's not real, he would chant, it's not real. Emily refused to leave a corner of the room, her eyes darting nervously at every sound. She sat huddled there, as though trying to make herself as small and inconspicuous as possible. Her fear was palpable, and it only seemed to make her more paranoid. Mike, in a desperate attempt to escape, tried to force open one of the windows. He didn't get far before injuring himself on the broken glass, his hands bloodied and his cries echoing through the cabin. "Let me out," he shouted, his voice raw with panic. "Let me out." Our attempts to comfort him did little to alleviate the growing tension. The cabin was turning us against each other, playing on our deepest fears and insecurities. We were all unraveling, our sanity fraying at the edges. It was during this time of heightened distress that I discovered something truly horrifying. As I lay in my sleeping bag, trying to block out the whispers and shadows, I felt a sharp sting on my arm. Groggily, I reached down and felt something strange, an unfamiliar mark, a symbol carved into my skin. It was a crude, jagged design that matched the markings we had seen earlier, etched into the floor of the cabin and the trees outside. "What is this?" I whispered, my voice shaking as I examined the mark in the dim light. It looked as though it had been carved with a blade, and I had no recollection of when or how it had happened. My heart pounded as I realized that the entity we were dealing with was not only tormenting us from the shadows, but was also leaving its mark on us in a more tangible way. Desperate to find some form of relief, we scoured the cabin for answers. We found an old book buried under the floorboards, its pages yellowed and brittle. Among the dusty, tattered pages was a ritual, a way to appease whatever was haunting us. The instructions were cryptic, but we were willing to try anything at this point. With trembling hands, we drew the ritual circle in the main room, using chalk and old, cracked candles. We gathered around it, each of us holding a piece of the ritual as instructed by the book. The air grew thick with tension as we began to recite the incantations, our voices quivering in the oppressive silence. The atmosphere shifted. The air grew colder, the shadows darker. It was as though the cabin itself was reacting to our attempt to appease it. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and the walls seemed to close in on us, pressing down with an almost physical force. The ritual circle began to glow faintly, casting an eerie light on our faces. Despite our efforts, the sense of dread only intensified. It felt as if the very essence of the cabin was absorbing our fear, feeding off it. The shadows seemed to dance with malevolent glee, and the whispers became a cacophony of voices, drowning out any hope of peace. We were trapped in a nightmare that was spiraling out of control. The ritual had done nothing to calm the haunting presence. If anything, it had only made things worse. The cabin seemed to be alive with a dark, malevolent force, and we were caught in its grip, desperately trying to find a way out before it consumed us completely. The ritual had backfired spectacularly. Instead of calming the malevolent force that haunted the cabin, it seemed to enrage it. The cabin trembled violently, the walls shuddering as if they were about to collapse. The shadowy figure that had been lurking in the corners became more aggressive, its presence growing more tangible. We could see its dark form moving with purpose, slashing out at us with a ferocity that was both terrifying and incomprehensible. It was chaos. The entity's attacks were relentless. One moment, we were huddled together in the ritual circle, and the next, the dark figure was among us, throwing us against walls and slamming doors. The fear and desperation were palpable, our screams echoing through the cabin as we tried to protect ourselves from the unearthly force that seemed intent on our destruction. In the midst of the chaos, I had a chilling realization. We had to offer something to the entity, something it truly desired, if we had any hope of surviving. It was an awful thought, but the desperation of the moment made it clear, a sacrifice might be the only way to appease the wrathful spirit. "I think, we have to make a sacrifice," I said, my voice trembling as I looked around at the others. "It's the only way to get out of here." There was a heavy silence. We all knew the implications of what I was suggesting, but we were out of options. The entity's attacks had left us battered and exhausted, and the cabin's oppressive atmosphere was nearly suffocating. Sarah, always the most selfless among us, stepped forward. "I'll do it," she said, her voice resolute despite the fear in her eyes. "I'll be the one to make the sacrifice. Just get out of here." We tried to protest, but Sarah's mind was made up. She believed that by offering herself, she could give the rest of us a chance to escape. We helped her prepare the space in the center of the room, and she took her place, her expression a mixture of bravery and sorrow. As Sarah began the ritualistic process, the cabin seemed to respond. The shadowy figure's attacks grew more frantic, as if it sensed that something was changing. We watched in horror as Sarah performed the ritual, the entity's rage filling the cabin with a blinding darkness. But the cabin was shaking more violently than ever, and I could barely stand. Just as the final words of the incantation were spoken, something shifted. The door to the cabin burst open with a thunderous roar, revealing the darkened forest outside. The entity let out an otherworldly scream that seemed to shake the very foundations of the cabin. "Run!" I yelled, and we didn't need any more encouragement. We fled through the open door, our hearts pounding with fear and adrenaline. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly before us, but we ran with everything we had, not daring to look back. We pushed through the trees, branches scratching at our skin, until we finally stumbled upon the safety of the trail. We collapsed onto the dirt path, gasping for breath as we looked back at the forest. The cabin was no longer visible through the thick trees, but we knew it was still out there, waiting for its next victims. When we finally made it back to civilization, it was like waking from a nightmare. The normalcy of the town felt surreal after the horrors we had endured. We were physically safe, but mentally scarred. The whispers that had followed us out of the forest never fully faded. They lingered at the edges of my thoughts, a constant reminder of what we had faced. No matter where I went, I could still hear them, calling my name with a chilling persistence. I knew the entity was still out there, lurking in the shadows of the forest, waiting. The experience had changed us all forever. We had escaped with our lives, but the memories and the whispers would haunt us always, a chilling reminder of the dark force that had almost claimed us.